George Harrison's journey into the world of music began when he was just a teenager in Liverpool, where he met Paul McCartney on a school bus. Despite being the younger, quieter one, George was drawn to Paul's assertiveness and his love for rock and roll. When he joined the Quarrymen, which would eventually become the Beatles, he was only 15 years old. Lennon initially doubted his ability, but after a second audition where George showcased his talent, he became a part of what would become the most iconic band in history. However, from the very start, George found himself in the shadow of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, who dominated the band's creative vision. While he was learning and growing musically, George struggled with being constantly sidelined. The Silent Beatle: Frustration and Musical Growth. As the Beatles rose to fame, George earned the label the Quiet Beatle. While the media romanticized his introversion, those close to him saw a deeper frustration taking root. George had musical ideas and aspirations that he wanted to express, but his contributions were often overlooked. When he presented songs or guitar arrangements, they were frequently dismissed or reworked by his bandmates, particularly Paul McCartney. Despite his growing talents as a songwriter, George felt overshadowed and undermined. Paul, with his perfectionism, often dominated the creative process. George would later reflect that Paul ruined him as a guitar player, not out of malice, but because of years of being subtly overshadowed. This frustration became the backdrop to George's journey with the Beatles. The breakthrough, the White Album and Let It Be sessions. By 1968, George had grown considerably as a songwriter, but the studio tensions were reaching a boiling point. The sessions for the White Album highlighted a shift in the band's dynamic. Paul McCartney had taken a dominant role in leading the band, while John Lennon, preoccupied with his relationship with Yoko Ono, grew more distant. George, who had spent years as a passive participant, was no longer content to be overlooked. During the Let It Be sessions, in 1969, an infamous moment captured the growing tensions between him and Paul. As Paul tried to dictate George's guitar part for Two of Us, George, with quiet defiance, responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all." This was the breaking point, and George briefly quit the band, signaling his frustration with the control and lack of respect. The final years of the Beatles: emotional distance and departure. While George returned to the Beatles after his brief departure, the damage had already been done. The rift between him and Paul widened. Although George continued to contribute songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun to Abbey Road, his relationship with Paul had been irrevocably altered. In 1970, the Beatles officially disbanded. But for George, the breakup was not just professional. It was deeply personal. While much of the media focused on the discord between John and Paul, George quietly distanced himself from both of them. The emotional toll of the band's disintegration left George with a sense of abandonment, particularly from Paul, whose controlling nature had stifled George's own creative spirit. All Things Must Pass, a triumphant solo career. In 1971, George Harrison released All Things Must Pass, a solo album that marked his creative rebirth. The album included songs that had been sidelined during his time with the Beatles, including My Sweet Lord and Wah Wah, a track many interpreted as a subtle jab at Paul McCartney's domineering behavior. The album's success both commercially and critically showcased George's immense talent and songwriting prowess. However, the album also symbolized the emotional bitterness he had carried from his years in the Beatles. In addition to the album's success, George also released Sue Me, Sue You Blues in 1973, which addressed the legal battles that followed the breakup of the band, further highlighting his frustrations with Paul, particularly over the lawsuit McCartney filed to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. The strained relationship with Paul McCartney. George Harrison's relationship with Paul McCartney was a central source of pain in his life. Despite their immense musical connection, George never fully reconciled with Paul, and their interactions were often marked by tension. In the years following the Beatles' split, George confessed to the psychological toll Paul had taken on him, especially in terms of his guitar playing. "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul," George admitted in a 1975 interview. He felt that Paul's perfectionism and control over the band's creative output had drained him of his confidence. This sense of being overshadowed left a deep emotional scar. Despite the passing years, George's discomfort with Paul's influence never fully dissipated. Lennon and Harrison, a complicated bond. While George's relationship with Paul was marked by frustration, his connection with John Lennon was equally complicated, albeit for different reasons. In the early years of the Beatles, George idolized John. He saw him as a mentor and looked up to his rebellious spirit. However, as time went on, John became increasingly absorbed in his relationship with Yoko Ono and distant from the band. George, who had turned to spirituality and Indian music, felt alienated from John, who mocked his new interests rather than embracing them. This emotional distance between them deepened as John's behavior grew erratic. By the time of John's tragic death in 1980, George had come to terms with the fact that their bond had irreparably changed. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, George barely mentioned John, a silence that spoke volumes about their complicated relationship. The Anthology Project, a glimpse of reconciliation. In 1994, George Harrison reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles Anthology Project, which was seen by fans as a sign of healing. However, behind the scenes, the old dynamics resurfaced. George found Paul's direction difficult to handle, and even though they worked together to complete John Lennon's unfinished demos, the tension was palpable. George admitted in interviews that working with Paul again felt like going back to school, a remark that revealed his lingering discomfort. Even with the passing of time, the wounds from their years in the Beatles were never fully healed, and their creative collaboration was often strained. Final years and quiet reflection. By the time the 1990s arrived, George Harrison had largely moved beyond the shadow of the Beatles. He had established a respected solo career, embracing his spirituality and philanthropy. Yet, despite his peaceful public image, the emotional scars from his years with the band were still present. In one interview, when asked about missing the Beatles, he responded simply, "Not with the others. No." This response, while lighthearted, revealed the deep emotional pain George carried. His final years were marked by quiet reflection, particularly after he was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997. Despite his illness, George maintained his sharp wit, famously quoting a Victorian proverb in one of his last public appearances: "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." This sentiment was quintessentially George, elegant, philosophical, but unmistakably pointed. George's last words: love and legacy. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, after a battle with cancer. In his final moments, he was surrounded by loved ones, including his wife, Olivia, and son, Diani. His last words, according to Olivia, were simple but profound: "Love one another." These words encapsulated the essence of George's journey, his search for peace, his spiritual insights, and his desire for reconciliation. Even in death, the complex relationships he had with his bandmates, particularly Paul McCartney, remained unresolved. Paul later described their final meeting, where they sat together holding hands, a gesture that symbolized the long journey from conflict to understanding, even if the wounds never fully healed. George Harrison's legacy lives on in his music, his spirituality, and the quiet strength with which he faced the challenges of his life.